The silver wings of the B-17s caught the morning light like mirrors of fire, high above the calm, shimmering waters north of New Britain. The distant rumble of their engines was the only sound that broke the silence at 25,000 feet. 16 flying fortresses held their formation, a constellation of American engineering and resolve moving with a purpose that the world below could not yet comprehend. Beneath them, the sea was a placid blue sheet, obediently carrying 8 Japanese transport ships and 4 destroyers on a straight, disciplined path. The convoy cut through the Bismarck Sea with an air of invincibility, a symbol of an empire's reach. Confident and unaware of the calculation unfolding in the thin, frozen air above. On the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer, Shikinami, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura adjusted his binoculars. The horizon was clear, the sea empty of any immediate threat. To him, the distant specks high above the clouds were a nuisance, not a danger. The doctrine was clear, proven by experience. No aircraft flying that high could hit a moving ship. His officers shared his confidence. They had all seen the clumsy, futile attempts of American bombers before, the bombs splashing harmlessly hundreds of meters away, a waste of ordnance and effort. This morning, he was sure, would be no different. The Empire's control of these waters was a matter of divine right and superior seamanship, not to be challenged by clumsy birds from the land. In the lead B-17, call sign Skull 42, Captain William Saunders checked the drift indicator, his breath fogging slightly inside his oxygen mask despite the sub-zero temperature that seeped into the cockpit. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines hummed a steady, powerful rhythm around him. Behind him, in the aircraft's transparent nose, the bombardier, Lieutenant James Dark Leland, was hunched over a device that looked more like a scientific instrument than a weapon. It was the Norden bombsight, a collection of gyroscopes, gears, and lenses encased in brass, the most secret mechanical computer of the war. Through its eyepiece, the world was reduced to numbers: altitude, wind speed, ground velocity, target drift. When those numbers aligned, the crosshairs it projected would become an instrument of destiny. The entire aircraft, in these final moments, was merely a platform for this single, precise purpose. The American crews had been briefed that morning by General George Kenney himself. Their orders were stark, simple, and unprecedented. Destroy the convoy at any cost. No torpedoes, no low-level runs that would expose them to the deadly gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. This was to be an attack of pure calculation and gravity. For months, the US Army Air Forces had been ridiculed by the Japanese Navy and even their own allies. Flying fortresses cannot hit ships. The Tokyo newspapers declared they were weapons for propaganda, not war. The men inside these 16 bombers intended to erase that sentence from history in a single, decisive strike. At 9:27 a.m., the formation began its attack run. 16 bombers lined up in a perfect 4-mile-long line, moving at 240 miles per hour. Each plane carried 10 500-pound demolition bombs fitted with delayed fuses, designed to penetrate a ship's deck, before detonating deep within its vitals. Over the intercom, voices were clipped professional. Target in sight. Steady. Bums away. One by one, the bomb bay doors yawned open, and black cylinders fell silently into the thin air. For the next 40 seconds, there was only the sound of the engines and the faint, persistent ticking of the bombsight's gyros spinning in their housings. Then, from below, came the first flash. On the destroyer of Arashio, lookouts screamed warnings that were instantly drowned out. The Japanese gunners swung their 25mm cannons upward, firing blindly into the vast, empty sky. But the B-17s were specks of silver, far beyond the range of their shells. The bombs fell through layers of cloud, invisible, accelerating to over 900 feet per second, silent and unstoppable until they struck. The first detonation lifted a column of water and flame higher than the ship's mast. The second hit squarely amidships, tearing through the deck and plunging into the ammunition magazine. The explosion that followed was not merely an explosion, it was a transformation of matter, turning steel into vapor and splinters. Within seconds, thick, black smoke curled upward, a dark signal against the bright blue sky. From 25,000 feet, the American pilots watched the orderly convoy scatter into chaos. Ships turned desperately, their white wakes looking like frantic scratches across a pane of blue glass. Captain Saunders steadied Skull 42 for a second run. Below him, another transport, the Cambu Maru, erupted in fire as its cargo of fuel drums ignited. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as tiny figures scrambled across the deck before being swallowed by the expanding flames. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Don Avery, whispered almost to himself, "We actually hit them. We really hit them." Saunders didn't answer. He was staring at the sight of entire ships burning beneath a single, precise row of bombs. For years, naval officers had claimed this was impossible. For the first time, the impossible was happening in front of human eyes. At sea level, Admiral Kimura could hardly breathe. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of cordite. Every doctrine he had trusted, every calculation of naval supremacy he had built his career upon, was collapsing in a matter of minutes. The sky, once a mere backdrop to the Empire's glory, had turned against him. What he saw above was not just aircraft, it was the machinery of a new kind of warfare. The era of the battleship was dying, and it did not even realize it had grown old. By 9:45 a.m., 5 Japanese ships were burning funeral pyres. The sea itself was on fire. Patches of burning oil spreading across the surface, black smoke merging with the clouds above. A single American bomber had been nicked by a stray piece of flak, limping southward trailing a thin wisp of smoke. But it was still flying. The Japanese gunners continued to fire, their rounds expending themselves in empty sky, a futile gesture of defiance. When the attack finally ended, the silence that descended was more unbearable than the noise. Kimura lowered his binoculars and said nothing. Around him, the surviving ships began the grim task of picking up survivors, most of whom were covered in oil and hideous burns. The convoy that had symbolized Japan's iron control of the Pacific now drifted in ruins. In less than 20 minutes, 16 aircraft from a single, primitive base had done what entire surface fleets had failed to accomplish in months. It was the day the sky sank the sea. The Japanese Navy had believed mathematics could not kill. But on that morning, the Americans proved that precision itself had become a weapon. For the Imperial Japanese Navy in early 1942, control of the Pacific seemed not just achievable, but permanent. Their fleets ruled the sea lanes from the Philippines to New Guinea. Their carriers had humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor, and their destroyers moved through the night like invisible predators. The Pacific, they believed, belonged to them by divine right and superior seamanship. Naval doctrine, perfected through decades of exercises and victories, declared that the ocean could only be conquered by ships. Aircraft might wound a fleet, but they could never destroy one outright. Bombers, in the Japanese military mind, were clumsy, land-based instruments, far removed from the elemental domain of the sea. Every principle of Japanese naval thinking was built upon that conviction. Surface vessels, especially the swift destroyers and powerful cruisers, would shield the transports, deliver the troops, and project power across the vast expanse of the Empire's island possessions. Their anti-aircraft gunnery was refined, disciplined, and deadly at low altitudes. Their crews were drilled to shoot down any torpedo bomber or dive bomber that dared to descend into their lethal range. But high-altitude bombers, they were a nuisance at best, a comical waste of resources. When American flying fortresses first appeared in the Southwest Pacific, Japanese officers laughed. They had watched those same aircraft miss stationary targets on land by hundreds of meters. Against ships, which moved unpredictably and left no stationary mark, the idea of success seemed utterly absurd. This laughter was echoed in official intelligence reports. Japanese analysts had meticulously recorded that the average American high-altitude bombing accuracy against shipping was less than 2%. The enemy lacks the ability to strike naval targets, one report concluded. Their machines are large but blind. Pilots of the Imperial Navy repeated the same dismissive phrase to each other like a mantra. Flying fortresses cannot hit ships. That belief became a shield of arrogance, protecting tradition from the uncomfortable reality of change. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the United States Army Air Forces were fighting a different kind of war, one waged not just against ships, but against disbelief. In dusty airfields from Hawaii to Queensland, young engineers and pilots tested new ways to hit what should have been impossible targets. Among them was a device so secret that few even within the military understood it completely, the Norden bomb sight. Created by the Dutch, American engineer Carl Norden, this mechanical analog computer promised to transform bombing from an art of guesswork into a science of mathematics. It calculated release angles, wind drift, and velocity with a precision that bordered on science fiction for its time. Its inventor famously claimed that with proper use, a bombardier could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The US Army Air Forces knew this claim was exaggerated, but they also knew it contained a dangerous, war-altering truth. The Norden could make bombing accurate enough to change strategy itself. The challenge was to prove it in combat. General George Kenney, newly assigned to command the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, understood both the opportunity and the skepticism. His superiors in Washington doubted that B-17s could ever succeed at sea, bombing ships from altitude. One admiral had scoffed. It was like trying to throw a stone into a bucket from a mountaintop. Kenney disagreed. He believed that technology, properly and ruthlessly used, could defeat even the strongest navy. While Japan relied on tradition, the Americans turned to innovation. They studied the problem like engineers, not warriors. The ocean, they realized, was not just a battlefield. It was a geometry problem. Ships moved along predictable courses. Weather followed measurable patterns. And gravity obeyed no nation. If mathematics could be tamed, then the sea itself could be targeted. The crews of the 19th and 43rd Bombardment Groups began intensive, grueling training in high-altitude precision attacks. Day after day, they flew over the coast of Australia, dropping practice bombs on moving barges, refining their calculations and adjusting their bomb sights. The early results were profoundly discouraging. The first attempts missed by hundreds of yards. The bomb sight required perfect data, wind speed, altitude, air density, and even a small error could mean total failure. But Kenney's men refused to give up. Mechanics modified the bomb racks for smoother, more simultaneous release. Bombardiers memorized complex formulas for drift correction. Meteorologists gathered the most detailed daily reports to feed into the Norden's intricate gears. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, their accuracy improved. By February of 19, training exercises showed that well-drilled crews could consistently place their bombs within 50 yards of a moving target, a spread that could bracket and destroy a ship. In Tokyo, Japanese admirals remained blissfully unaware that the Americans were quietly rewriting the rules of engagement. Their focus stayed on the coming offensives in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Convoys like Admiral Kimura's carried men and material to reinforce Leh and Salamoa, confident that American aircraft could harass, but not halt them. Each convoy was a small empire in motion, destroyers flanking the transports, lookouts perpetually scanning the horizon, anti-aircraft guns manned day and night. Yet every voyage stretched Japan's resources thinner. Every ship that sailed carried not just soldiers and supplies, but the empire's unwavering faith in its own invincibility. When reports arrived that B-17s had begun operating out of Port Moresby, Japanese officers dismissed them with a wave. "Let them come," one captain said. "They will miss." As always. They did not know that the men of the 43rd Bombardment Group had spent months preparing for this exact mission, studying tides, cloud layers, and the specific behavior of Japanese ships in convoy. Each bombardier had memorized the fall curves for different bomb weights at specific altitudes. Each pilot had practiced formation flying until the squadron moved as a single, cohesive machine. The Americans were turning war into an equation, and the equation was nearly solved. In the final briefings before the March mission, General Kenny spoke to his crews plainly. "You're going to show them what an American machine can do," he said, his voice low and intense. "They think you can't hit a ship from the sky. Prove them wrong." The men nodded, their faces young and serious. Many of them were barely 20 years old. Few had ever seen a Japanese ship up close. None yet understood that their mission would become one of the quiet, turning points in the history of air warfare. Back across the sea, in Rubble's naval headquarters, Admiral Kimura finalized his orders for the Lei convoy. 8 transports, loaded with thousands of troops and vital supplies, would sail under the watchful escort of 4 capable destroyers. Weather forecasts were favorable, the skies expected to remain clear. He had no reason to believe the enemy could find him, much less destroy him. The Imperial Navy had fought too many battles, mastered too many tactics, to fear an unproven technology. That night, as Kimura's fleet slipped out of the harbour under a moonless sky, the stars above shimmered faintly. To his men, they were symbols of divine protection. To the Americans assembling hundreds of miles away, those same stars were coordinate markers for a target that would soon burn beneath them. By the time dawn broke over the Bismarck Sea, 2 worlds were on a collision course. One was ruled by tradition, the other by technology. One believed in gunners and guns, the other in gyroscopes and gears. The question was no longer whether a bomb could hit a ship. It was whether an empire built on old faith could survive a century defined by machines. The transformation of the flying fortress from a blunt instrument of strategic bombing into a scalpel of naval destruction did not happen in sterile laboratories or quiet lecture halls. It happened in the heat, dust, and sweat of makeshift airfields across northern Australia, where engineers worked beneath the shade of palm trees and pilots practiced in skies so bright they had to squint to see their instruments. In early 1942, the 43rd Bombardment Group operated out of primitive bases like Mariba and Charters Towers. Clusters of corrugated steel huts, surrounded by mud and plagued by mosquitoes. Spare parts were scarce, tools were improvised, and every flight risked engine failure or worse. Yet, in these harsh conditions, American mechanics, scientists, and airmen fused their knowledge into something new, a flying equation of death and precision. The key lay in understanding that the B-17 was not just a bomber. It was a machine of interconnected systems. Every dial, cable, and valve was connected to something else, and each had to perform with flawless perfection for the Norden bomb site to fulfill its devastating promise. The bomb site itself, a compact cylinder of brass, glass, and whirring gyroscopes, looked deceptively simple. Inside, however, were more than 2,000 precision-engineered parts. It could calculate true airspeed, drift angle, and bomb trajectory in real time. The bombardier, crouched in the aircraft's transparent nose, would input data by hand. Wind direction, altitude, target course, and the device would mechanically compute the exact release moment. Once set and synchronized, the Norden could even take control of the aircraft's autopilot, turning the massive bomber into a self-guided gun platform for those few, critical seconds before release. To most of the men who used it, the Norden was part miracle, part mystery. They called it the brain, and they treated it with a reverence bordering on the sacred. When not in use, each bomb site was locked inside a heavy safe under armed guard. Before missions, the bombardiers carried them to the aircraft inside padded, waterproof cases, like priests bearing holy relics. The secrecy surrounding the device was absolute. The Army Air Forces feared that if it ever fell into enemy hands, the technological edge it provided would vanish overnight. But technology alone was not enough. Precision required an iron discipline. At Port Moresby, General Kenny ordered weeks of intensive, repetitive training before the B-17s would ever be sent against a real convoy. Bombardiers practiced on floating targets made of lashed, together oil drums, their instructors timing every drop with a stopwatch. The early sessions were humiliating. Bombs fell wide, scattering across the vast expanse of water. We were missing a whole ocean. One bombardier joked bitterly. Yet, the crews learned. They adjusted for humidity, for tricky crosswinds, for the way the tropical heat distorted air density. They discovered that a single misread gauge, a fraction of a degree of error, could mean a miss by hundreds of feet. Slowly, painstakingly, the math and the muscle began to merge. Inside the aircraft during a run, every man's role was critical. The pilot had to maintain altitude and heading to within a fraction of a degree. The navigator tracked drift using the stars and a stopwatch, calling out corrections. The bombardier synchronized his crosshairs with the moving ship below, his voice a calm, steady monotone over the intercom. Left, 10, steady, steady. The entire crew became a single, human machine, each man a vital gear in the larger mechanism of destruction. When it worked, it was a thing of beauty. When it failed, the ocean swallowed their efforts without a trace. In February 1942, during a test exercise over the Coral Sea, the crews finally saw proof that their efforts were not in vain. A practice bomb, fitted with a smoke charge, struck within 40 feet of a moving barge. The watching officers erupted in cheers. It was the first time in the Pacific Theater that a high-altitude bomber had come close enough to theoretically destroy a ship. The next week, another crew repeated the feat, this time scoring a direct hit. Confidence grew, but so did a cold, hard fear. Every man knew that in real combat, the ships would shoot back. To prepare for that brutal reality, the engineers modified the B-17s themselves. They reinforced the bomb bay doors to handle the shock of a rapid, simultaneous release. They recalibrated the bomb racks for faster, more reliable cycling. Some mechanics, on their own initiative, adjusted the propeller governors to squeeze an extra few knots of speed out of the engines during the critical attack run. These were unofficial modifications, field hacks born of desperation and ingenuity, but they made the aircraft deadlier and more responsive. The crews nicknamed their planes after women, hometowns, or private jokes. Skull 42, Miss Carrie, Yankee Doodle. Beneath each name was a line of hand, painted bombs marking missions flown, many of them still without a confirmed combat kill. The next one, they all knew, would be different. General Kenny's belief in engineering bordered on religious faith. He saw the B-17 not just as a bomber, but as a symbol of American industrial superiority, a weapon of logic against an enemy bound by ritual. To him, every screw in a Norden bomb site was a declaration that the future belonged to precision. He often said to his officers, "If we can hit a ship at 20,000 feet, We can hit anything. That conviction inspired a generation of airmen who began to believe that science, not luck, would win the war. Still, skepticism persisted. Navy officers openly doubted the value of high-altitude bombing, insisting that torpedoes were the only sure way to sink ships. Even within the Army, some senior commanders argued that the B-17 should stick to its intended role of striking strategic targets. Factories, cities, airfields, not dancing with the fleet. But the Pacific was a vast, watery laboratory that erased old boundaries and doctrines. There were no clear front lines, only endless ocean. If the Americans could not stop the Japanese convoys, New Guinea would fall and Australia would be next. The B-17, for all its flaws and its skeptics, was the only weapon capable of reaching that far, of striking that deep. By late February, the experiment had become a necessity. Japanese reinforcements were steadily moving toward Lae, and intelligence reports placed a major convoy preparing to depart from Rabaul. The moment Kenny had waited for was coming. He called his senior officers together and laid out the plan. 16 flying fortresses would strike from high altitude at dawn, using weather fronts and the element of surprise. There would be no torpedo bombers, no dive bombers, no naval guns to support them. Only the cold precision of their machines and the courage of their crews. In the last week before the mission, the bombardiers practiced every day, sometimes in stormy weather, sometimes under a perfect, deceptive blue sky. They learned to trust the sight implicitly, to feel the rhythm of its spinning gyros, to let the numbers replace instinct. One of them, Lieutenant Leland, wrote in his logbook the night before the mission, "Tomorrow, the numbers go to war." The evening before takeoff, the base at Port Moresby was unnaturally quiet, the silence broken only by the hum of generators and the distant crash of surf on the reef. Mechanics worked through the night by the light of dim floodlights, loading bombs, checking fuses, and carefully polishing the glass domes of the Norden sights. In the officers' mess, pilots pored over maps by the light of kerosene lanterns, tracing the route in their minds. Across the jagged Owen Stanley Range, over impenetrable jungle and then open sea, straight into enemy airspace. Few men spoke. Each knew, in his gut, that the next day would either prove the B-17's worth as a ship killer or expose their entire endeavour as a costly, tragic failure. As midnight passed, a soft rain swept across the runway, cooling the metal skins of the waiting aircraft and washing the dust from the air. Somewhere in the darkness, a crew chief tightened the last bolt on a bomb rack and patted the metal flank of his plane affectionately. "You'll do fine, girl," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. At 4:30 a.m., the first engines roared to life, shattering the pre-dawn calm. Flames spat from the exhaust stacks as the propellers blurred into invisible silver discs. The sound rolled through the camp like continuous thunder. From their tents, men watched the shadows of the bombers stretch and warp across the wet ground. In the control tower, a single light blinked green. One after another, the flying fortresses began to roll down the runway, heavy with fuel, bombs, and a desperate kind of hope. What rose into the sky that morning was not just a squadron of aircraft. It was an idea made real. For the first time in history, an air force was setting out to rewrite the laws of naval warfare through calculation alone. The Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting the art of command at sea. The Americans had spent months perfecting the science of striking from the air. When those two visions met over the Bismarck Sea, the question would no longer be about courage or numbers. It would be about which nation could adapt faster, tradition or technology. As dawn painted the eastern horizon in streaks of red and gold, the 16 B-717s leveled off at their cruising altitude, their engines humming in a synchronized, powerful rhythm. In the nose of each aircraft, the Norden bomb sight began to warm up, its gyros spinning up to speed, whispering softly as if alive. Far below, the Japanese convoy steamed forward, its crews unaware that the future was already calculating their destruction. The night before the strike, the airfield at Port Moresby lay cloaked in a wet, tropical mist. Mechanics moved like ghosts under the dim floodlights, their shadows dancing across the aluminum skin of the bombers. Fuel trucks hissed as they dispensed their volatile cargo. Engines coughed and sputtered to life during final checks, and the acrid smell of aviation gasoline hung over everything like a pall. No one spoke loudly. A grim, focused tension had settled over the base. Every man knew what the morning would bring. For days, they had trained for this single moment. 16 bombers. 16 chances to prove that precision could replace brute force. At 0430 hours, the first B-17 engine cracked the silence, a single, sharp report that was quickly joined by others until the air vibrated with the rolling thunder of 60, four right cyclones. One by one, the propellers caught, spinning into a blur, churning the humid air. Crew chiefs circled the aircraft, signaling thumbs up to the pilots in the cockpits. Inside, the crews ran through their checklists with practiced efficiency. Hydraulics set. Mixture rich. Flaps 15. The sky above the Owen Stanley Range was still a deep, star-flecked black, the constellations beginning to fade behind a veil of thin, high cloud. Captain William Saunders, commanding the lead aircraft, Skull 42, looked out his cockpit window at the row of bombers behind him, their navigation lights blinking steady red and green, a chain of fireflies stretching back into the darkness. At 0510, the control tower's green lamp blinked twice. Takeoff. Saunders eased the 4 throttles forward, feeling the immense vibration of the engines shake through his seat and into his bones. The plane rolled, gathering speed, feeling heavy and sluggish with a full load of fuel and 10 500-pound bombs slung in its belly. The runway lights became a blur. Then the weight shifted, the wheels lifted, and the bomber rose into the darkness, the roar of its engines echoing off the silent, brooding mountains. One by one, the others followed, climbing laboriously into a loose formation. The climb was brutal. The B-17s lumbered upwards, battling rising air currents and patches of thin fog that licked at their wings. The Owen Stanleys loomed below, black silhouettes of jungle, covered ridges rising to over 10,000 feet. Turbulence jolted the aircraft, tossing loose coffee mugs and navigation charts around the cockpit. The bombardiers, crammed in their plexiglass noses, watched distant lightning flash far to the east, illuminating the colossal cloud banks. It was a hard, dangerous route, known to the pilots as the hump, but it kept them hidden from Japanese radar and coastal watchers until the last possible moment. At 0700 hours, the bombers finally cleared the last razor, backed ridge and leveled out above the Coral Sea. The world below them opened up into an endless, breathtaking blue. In the first light of dawn, the formation spread out into its combat spacing, 4 squadrons of 4 aircraft, about 2 miles apart, maintaining strict radio silence. The only sound was the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of the engines, and the occasional crackle of static in their headsets. The crews chewed gum, checked their oxygen lines, and tried not to think about what waited for them ahead. Navigator to pilot. Lieutenant Frank Tully's voice came over the intercom in Skull 42. He marked their position with a grease pencil on a worn paper chart, 100 miles to the target zone. Saunders nodded, a tight, grim gesture. At this altitude, the air was freezing cold. Frost gathered around the edges of the windows, and their breath fogged the inside of their oxygen masks. Below them, scattered clouds drifted like isolated, white islands, innocent and peaceful. Somewhere beneath that blanket of white was the Japanese convoy, steaming steadily toward Leh. At 80:15, the radio operator aboard Skull 42 caught a faint, broken signal from a coast watcher stationed near Buna. His voice was thin, strained through layers of static. Enemy convoy sighted. Course 180, speed 8 knots, 8 transports, 4 destroyers. The message repeated twice, then faded into the ether. Saunders turned to his co-pilot, Lieutenant Don Avery. That's them. The formation altered course 10 degrees east. The pilots trimmed their controls and began a slow, gradual descent to their attack altitude of 25,000 feet. Below, the first shadows of ships appeared through breaks in the cloud deck, grey shapes moving with insect, like purpose across a vast blue mirror. Even at that great distance, the sharp, white wake lines trailing behind each vessel were clearly visible in the morning sun. Convoy visual. The navigator confirmed. In the noses of the bombers, the bombardiers adjusted their sights, their world narrowing to the eyepiece of the Norden. They aligned the crosshairs with the distant toy, like columns of smoke rising from the ship's funnels. Through the lenses, the ocean became a grid of motion and numbers. The gyro spun, a soft, persistent whir. Data fed through intricate gears and cams. Altitude, speed, wind drift. Each tiny correction brought the bomb site closer to perfect alignment with the moving target far below. On the Japanese destroyer Shiratsuyu, a lookout spotted dark specks glinting high above, tiny slivers of silver catching the sun. Airplanes. High altitude, someone shouted. The gunnery officer lifted his binoculars, squinting into the intense glare. Too high, he muttered, almost to himself, dismissing the threat. The anti-aircraft crews swiveled their guns anyway, more from drilled in habit than any real alarm. They had seen this before. American bombers at extreme height, their bombs falling harmlessly into the sea, a pointless spectacle. But the men in those B-17s were not guessing. They were calculating. In Skull 42, Bombardier Lieutenant Leland leaned forward over the Norden sight, his fingers making fine adjustments on the azimuth knob, the ship in his lens. A transport identified as the Kembo Maru slid perfectly into the crosshairs. His voice was calm, devoid of emotion. Steady, steady, left 5. Hold it. The autopilot, linked directly to the bomb site, began making infinitesimal corrections, nudging the plane's course automatically. Target locked, Leland said. His thumb hovered over the release toggle. Below, the Japanese ships began their defensive maneuvers. The destroyers increased speed, zigzagging ahead of the slower transports. Black puffs of flak blossomed in the sky far, far below the bombers. Harmless at that altitude, but beautiful and strange in their geometric patterns. The air gunners aboard the B-17s watched through their side windows, silent and awed by the sight of the anti-aircraft explosions blooming miles beneath them like a field of dark flowers. Bums away. The release clunked heavily through the fuselage. The bomber shuddered slightly as 5.5-ton bombs fell clear of the bay. The aircraft lifted, suddenly lighter, buoyant. Through the small window beside him, the navigator saw a chain of black dots tumbling earthward, growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared into a layer of cloud. He started counting silently. 1, 2, 3. At 38 seconds, the ocean below erupted. The first bomb struck the Kembo Maru directly amidships. The explosion split the vessel in two, a geyser of flame and water shooting skyward. 2 more bombs landed close to her port side, their concussive force tearing open her hull. Within seconds, the transport was a single, continuous sheet of fire from bow to stern. The destroyer Arashio, maneuvering to assist, turned directly into the path of the falling bombs from another B-17 and took a direct hit near the bridge. Her mast and fire control tower crumpled like a child's toy. The third ship in line, the Tamara Maru, tried to turn away, but the shockwaves from the nearby detonations rolled her onto her side, her superstructure scraping the water. From 25,000 feet, the scene looked both unreal and terrifyingly vivid, like a slow motion inferno painted on glass. The bombardiers could see flashes of brilliant orange reflected off the sea, and the smoke spiraled upward in thick, black columns until it reached their altitude. In Skull 42, the waist gunner leaned out his window, the freezing wind whipping at his jacket. "My God," he whispered, his voice choked. "We hit them. We really hit them." Saunders held the bomber steady for a second run, his eyes scanning the instruments. "Maintain formation," he ordered, his voice tight. "We're going again." Down below, chaos reigned. Japanese gunners fired wildly into the sky, their shells bursting thousands of feet short of their targets. Communication lines between ships failed as officers screamed orders that were lost in static and the roar of fire. Survivors, some ablaze, leaped into the water as spilled fuel, and oil ignited across the surface, spreading flames faster than the waves could extinguish them. The second wave of B-17s arrived 5 minutes later. They dropped another volley, each bomb guided by the same cold, unerring precision. Within 15 minutes, the convoy that had sailed in perfect, disciplined order was now a scattered cluster of burning wrecks, the smoke columns merging into one dark, impenetrable wall that stretched for miles across the horizon. In his after-action report, Captain Saunders would write only one sentence to describe that moment. The sea looked like it was burning. For the first time in naval history, a high-altitude bombing attack had annihilated a fleet in open water. The Japanese sailors below, those who survived, would call it ten no tetsu, iron from the heavens. To them, it felt less like an attack and more like a divine punishment. The voice of a narrator might slow here, almost whispering. For centuries, mankind believed the ocean could not be conquered from the air. On that morning, 16 aircraft proved otherwise. At 0925 hours, the sky above the Bismarck Sea was a perfect, untroubled blue, too beautiful for the business of war. Then the horizon seemed to crack open. 16 B-17 flying fortresses emerged from the glare of the sun, silver arcs gleaming as they swung into their final attack formation. To the men on the ships below, they seemed to appear out of nowhere, silent, massive, and utterly untouchable. The Japanese convoy, still stubbornly steaming south toward Leh, broke its rigid columns as lookouts screamed new orders, their voices raw with panic. On the destroyer, Arashio, Captain Tomotsu Tanemura raised his binoculars and froze. Tiny black dots were falling from the heavens, at first mistaken for debris, then recognized for what they were. His voice cut through the chaos on the bridge. Hard to port. The helmsman spun the wheel, but it was too late. The first detonation came without any warning sound, only a flash that consumed the world. The deck rose violently beneath the crew's feet, throwing men against bulkheads with bone-shattering force. Plates shattered. Metal screamed as the explosion ripped through the forward magazine. In the engine room, fire burst from ruptured fuel lines, sucking the very oxygen from the air. Within seconds, the destroyer was completely engulfed in a shroud of black, oily smoke. From 25,000 feet above, the crew of the B-17s saw the plume rising, a thin, perfect column that curled at the top into a nascent mushroom shape. Over the intercom came the calm, professional voice of Lieutenant Leland, bombardier of Skull 42V, direct hit. Target neutralized. No one cheered. They were too busy, their minds already shifting to the next pass, adjusting altitude, and setting up for the next target. Behind Skull 42, the second element, 4 bombers under Captain Frank, Tex, Morgan, rolled into position. Morgan's bombardier had locked onto a large transport, the Showa Maru, loaded with nearly 700 soldiers of the 51st Division. Through the northern sight, the transport filled the crosshairs like a patient under a surgeon's scalpel. Morgan called over the intercom, "Hold her steady, boys." His co-pilot responded, "Steady as she goes, Captain." The bombs fell cleanly, 5 black streaks descending in perfect symmetry. They struck amidships, one penetrating deep into the cargo hold before detonating. The blast tore the ship apart from the inside. Steel plates peeled backward, like the petals of a grotesque metal flower, and an enormous orange fireball burst through the deck, swallowing the superstructure. The concussion rolled across the sea like a physical wall, rocking nearby destroyers. Men on neighboring ships felt the heat on their faces, even from half a mile away. Radio chatter erupted among the B-17 crews, a controlled chaos of clipped, technical tones. Target burning shift to secondary, no flak accuracy. They're blind. Watch that crosswind, altitude 25,500. Over the open frequency. One gunner, his voice tight with emotion, muttered, "This is for Pearl Harbor." The Japanese gunners tried to fight back. Dozens of 25mm cannons and a few larger 5-inch guns opened fire, filling the air with a forest of black puffs. The shells burst thousands of feet below the bombers, a useless but defiant gesture. The crews on the Air Horatio and Shirakumo screamed in frustration as falling fragments of their own shrapnel rained down on their decks, causing fresh casualties. At 09:35, the third wave of bombers arrived, 4 aircraft under Captain Saunders himself. They targeted the center of the disintegrating convoy, where 2 transports were attempting to maneuver side by side, their wakes cutting frantic. White arcs through the blue water. Saunders looked down through the cockpit window, his hands resting steady on the throttles. He could see the ships clearly now, each one a dark, wounded smear beneath a halo of its own smoke. "All right, boys," he said,